So just to wrap it up here, I do think it's rather clear then how this notion of a bad thing, all things considered, something all things considered bad for someone, really does provide Feldman with a way of stating, at least on the face of it, that would be a coherent, intelligible way of claiming that someone's death is bad for them. Maybe the way he puts it a little bit further on might help. This is in the second paragraph on page 321. He says, talking of a hypothetical woman, Lindsay, he says, for when we say that her death is bad for her, we are really expressing a complex fact about the relative values of two possible worlds. If these worlds stand in a certain value relation, then, given that they stand in this relation at any time, they stand in that relation not only when Lindsay exists, but at times when she does not. That's actually having to do with the question of the puzzle of, if death is a misfortune, when does it occur? And his answer is eternally, because really what we're doing when we say that somebody's death is a misfortune, as he says, we are expressing a complex fact about the relative values of two possible worlds. That is, he's clearly rejecting the idea that death is some sort of direct bad, intrinsic bad. That is something that was suffered as bad. He rejects that, but there are other sorts of bad. That something may happen which intrinsically may be neutral, he says, but is bad in its effects, and it's bad in its effects if it makes one's life worse than it could have been. And the meaning of that worse than could have been is supplied by the idea of possible worlds. In the section 316, The Evil of Death, he says, well, we already read that, but he gives this example of thinking that he might die on a trip to Europe, and he says, I think this would be bad for me. In this world in which I died, say, a horrible plane crash. He says the main difference is that in that world I suffer some terminal pain and then a premature death and never live to enjoy my retirement. Let us suppose that that world is worth plus 500 to me. That is, all the pleasures and pains added together for me in that world add up to plus 500. Then we we consider the nearest world in which I do not die en route to Europe on this trip. The relevant feature of this world is that I do not die a painful and premature death in an airplane accident. Suppose I there do live to enjoy many happy years of retirement. Let us suppose my welfare level at that world is plus 1100. This implies that my death on this trip would have a value of negative 600 for me. It would be a terrible misfortune. So what does the misfortune consist in? Well, the misfortune consists in the event of dying in a plane crash when, say, you're 40 years old. Why is that a misfortune? Well, because we can imagine a possible world in which this didn't happen, in which this death in this way at that time did not happen. A possible world in which one lives for several more decades and has a positive outcome of happiness overall. Pleasures predominate over pains. So in the world in which one dies at 40 in a plane crash, your total value of that world for you, let's say, is plus 500. Again, adding together pleasures and pains. The other possible world in which you don't die in that plane crash at 40 but live on for several decades has a value of plus 1100. So what does the misfortune consist in? Misfortune consists in this event causing you to miss out on 600 units, and again, this is a crude axiology, but 600 units of value that otherwise you would have received. Now, what is it that he's doing here? I mean, there are some other matters here that he deals with, but they're all more or less solved by reference to this idea of something bad can be said to happen to someone. It doesn't have to be intrinsically bad, but if it results in a lower overall welfare than another possible world, a near possible world, a similar possible world, in which that event doesn't occur, then one can consider it to be a misfortune for someone. It all sort of goes back to that. And he admits at the end, we'll skip several of the last things where he deals with these smaller matters. He admits at the end that this is a deprivation theory. He says at the end, page 326, I have claimed that there is nothing paradoxical about the idea that death may be a bad for the one who died. My answer is a version of the traditional view that death is bad when it is bad, because he leaves open the possibility that sometimes it may not be a bad, because the possible world in which one does not die may be worse for one than the possible world in which one does die. My answer is a version of the traditional view that death is bad when it is bad, primarily because it deprives the deceased of goods, the goods he would have enjoyed if he had lived. So really what this turns out to be is a version of Nagel's strategy, his general strategy in his essay Death, that death is a bad because it deprives us of goods. And what Feldman has done, I think in a very interesting way, has provided maybe a more sophisticated basis for making that claim of deprivation, what exactly it means. He's given us this possible world's language to use, and that when we say that someone has been deprived of goods by death, what we mean is that them dying when they did results in an overall welfare quantity, one might say, a quantity of welfare in their life. And that if we imagine a possible world in which they didn't die when they did, we would get a different welfare quantity, one might say, when we add up all the pleasures and pains in that world for that person if they had died at a later time. And clearly, if the welfare amount, or the amount of welfare, the amount of good that they experience in the possible world in which they don't die at that time outweighs the welfare that they experience in the possible world where they do die at that time,